Ever bought a house or even just like dreamt about it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, today's deep dive might just change how you view that whole process.
Okay.
We're taking a deep dive into Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the giants behind the U.S. mortgage market.
You know, what's so interesting about these companies is they're like these ghosts of the financial system.
Really?
Technically, they're in conservatorship limbo since that whole 2008 crisis.
Right.
Not dead, not really alive, just kind of existing.
It's like a financial timeout that never actually ended. And here's the thing, even if you've never heard of them, Fannie and Freddie have a huge impact on your ability to buy a house and how much it costs. We're talking like the difference between a decent interest rate and one that makes your eyes water.
Yeah, it all boils down to their role in the U.S. mortgage market. To understand their power, we need to rewind all the way back to the 1930s and the Great Depression.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Imagine a housing market in shambles. Short-term mortgages, fluctuating interest rates, and defaults everywhere. The American dream of home ownership was pretty much a fantasy for most people.
So picture this. Breadlines, economic turmoil, and then enter Fannie Mae, a government solution to a very real crisis, like a superhero in a financial drama, right?
But not quite a glamorous debut.
Right.
Fannie Mae was created out of pure necessity.
Right.
The government needed a way to stabilize the housing market, encourage banks to lend, and make homeownership a possibility again.
So that's how the government got into the mortgage business. But this was no ordinary business. We're talking about creating a system that would shape the American dream for generations to come. And as our source material, Bethany McLean's Shaky Ground, reveals, this is where things start to get really interesting.
See, what's unique about the U.S. mortgage market is the 30-year fixed-rate loan.
Okay.
Unlike other countries where shorter-term loans are the norm, the U.S. system is built on this long-term commitment. But those loans, they come with risks. And that's where Fannie and Freddie come in.
So they're like the wizards behind the curtain making this whole 30-year fixed-rate magic work. How does that even work?
They take on those risky 30-year loans from banks, bundle them together, and turn them into mortgage-backed securities. Investors love these securities because they're seen as safe, almost as good as government bonds. Fannie and Freddie, backed by the implicit promise of a government bailout, provide that sense of security.
Okay, so that's how they gained so much power. They became the bridge between Main Street homebuyers and Wall Street investors. But power, as we know, can be a dangerous thing. And as Fannie Mae grows in the 1990s, things get a bit messy. Think political maneuvering, intense lobbying, and a whole lot of controversy.
This is where Jim Johnson enters the picture.
Okay.
As Fannie Mae CEO, he transforms the company into a political powerhouse. Think of him as a master strategist, building relationships with politicians, influencing policy, and solidifying Fannie's grip on the mortgage market.
McLean doesn't hold back in Shaky Ground, calling Johnson the chairman of the universe. That sounds more like a Bond villain than a CEO. He even had a standing weekly breakfast meeting with the House Speaker at the time. How much closer to the halls of power can you get?
And this is where we start to see the emergence of what some call the housing industrial complex.
Interesting.
Fannie and Freddie, along with their allies in Congress and the real estate industry, created a system that benefited them greatly, but also raised questions about their influence and accountability.
And a big part of that system was the affordable housing goals that Congress imposed on Fannie and Freddie in 1992, right? The idea was to make homeownership more accessible to low and moderate income families. A noble goal for sure, but was it the right tool for the job?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
On the surface, these goals seem like a good thing.
Right.
Who wouldn't want more people to own homes?
Sure.
But critics argue that these mandates pushed Fannie and Freddie towards riskier lending practices, ultimately contributing to the conditions that led to the 2008 financial crisis.
Okay, so we've got this potent mix brewing a powerful company, political influence, and these well-intentioned goals that might have had some unintended consequences. But before we dive into that, we need to talk about the accounting scandal that rocked Fannie Mae in the early 2000s. Talk about a plot twist.
Picture this. It's the early 2000s and the good times seem to be rolling, especially in the housing market.
Right.
But behind Fannie Mae's gleaming facade, a different story is unfolding. A massive accounting scandal worth a staggering $11 billion.
$11 billion. That's not just a rounding error. It makes you wonder, what were they thinking? Was it simply a case of bad judgment, or was there something more sinister going on?
Well, McLean's Shaky Ground really digs into this. She uncovers this high-stakes game between Fannie Mae, its regulator, OVEO, a now defunct agency that was supposed to keep Fannie in check, and the Bush administration, which was pushing for deregulation.
Wow.
Imagine a tug of war with billions of dollars at stake and accusations flying everywhere, risky bets, inflated earnings, and political pressure to meet those affordable housing goals, no matter the cost.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster. And all of this is happening while the housing bubble is inflating, right? Subprime mortgages, those loans given to borrowers with shaky credit, are becoming increasingly popular. And Wall Street is packaging them into these complex securities that are supposed to be safe. What could possibly go wrong?
You're catching on. And here's where things get even more interesting. Remember those mortgage-backed securities that Fannie and Freddie were experts in? Well, they were buying those too, including ones backed by these risky subprime loans.
So they were playing both sides of the field, taking on even more risk. It sounds like they got caught up in the frenzy, trying to maintain their dominance in a rapidly changing market.
Exactly. McLean highlights this dilemma in her book. She quotes a presentation given at a Fannie Mae executive retreat in 2005. An executive warns, "We face two stark choices: stay the course or meet the market where the market is." Staying true to their core business meant potentially losing market share and profits. Meeting the market, however, meant diving headfirst into riskier territory.
So they chose the riskier path. But didn't anyone see the warning signs? Were Fannie and Freddie pressured by those affordable housing goals? Or were they simply driven by their own ambition and a desire to stay on top?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? McLean presents a balanced perspective, showcasing both sides of the argument. On one hand, there's evidence that the government, during that wave of deregulation, saw subprime mortgages as a way to promote homeownership without direct government involvement, essentially passing the buck to the private market.
So a hands-off approach that backfired spectacularly. But you're saying Fannie and Freddie weren't exactly innocent bystanders either.
Exactly. While they might have faced external pressures, McLean also reveals this internal drive within Fannie and Freddie to maintain their market dominance. There's this sense of, we've always been the leaders and we can't afford to fall behind.
Pride comes before the fall, as they say. And in this case, the fall was catastrophic. By the time the music stopped in 2008, Fannie and Freddie were sitting on a mountain of risky assets, their capital reserves depleted. And then came the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the financial system teetering on the brink.
September 2008, it's a date etched in the memories of anyone who lived through it. The dominoes were falling, and the government, led by Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, realized they had to act fast. The solution: conservatorship for Fannie and Freddie.
Okay, so time for a quick definition break. What does conservatorship actually mean? It sounds like being grounded by your parents, but for giant financial institutions.
It's kind of like that. Basically, it's a way for the government to step in and stabilize a company that's on the verge of collapse. They take control of the company's operations, but it's not a full-blown nationalization.
So a temporary intervention to prevent total meltdown.
That was the idea, at least. But here we are, over 15 years later, and Fannie and Freddie are still under conservatorship. It's like that temporary fix that became a permanent solution with these giant companies stuck in limbo.
And to make things even more complicated, this whole situation attracts some unexpected players. Hedge funds, they swooped in, sensing an opportunity in the midst of the chaos.
You got it. These hedge funds, known for their appetite for risk and complex financial maneuvers, started buying up Fannie and Freddie stock. Their bet that eventually the government would have to release these companies from conservatorship and their value would skyrocket.
It's like a financial thriller. So they were betting on a comeback story, the rise of the phoenix from the ashes of the financial crisis.
Precisely. And here's where it gets really interesting.
So these hedge funds, they were right about one thing. Fannie and Freddie did start making money again. Hand over fist, even.
Yeah.
It's almost ironic, isn't it? The very companies that needed a bailout were now raking in profits.
The irony is pretty palpable.
Right.
And it's largely thanks to those accounting rules that got them in hot water in the first place. But here's the real kicker. Instead of those profits going back to Fannie and Freddie to help them get back on their feet, the government stepped in.
Wait, you're telling me the government, the one that bailed them out, decided to just take all the profits?
You got it. They implemented this thing called the Third Amendment,
Okay.
which basically diverted all of Fannie and Freddie's profits straight to the Treasury Department.
Wow.
Think of it like this. Imagine you're finally getting back on your feet after, like, a financial setback, but then someone swoops in and takes every paycheck you earn.
That's harsh. So the hedge funds that bet on Fannie and Freddie's comeback were understandably furious, right?
You bet. They felt cheated, like the rug had been pulled out from under them. They argued that the government was violating their property rights as shareholders. This sparked a whole legal battle that's still ongoing, by the way.
So it's like a whole new chapter in this saga. From bailout to profit grab to courtroom drama. What a mess. But it sounds like these hedge funds aren't exactly getting a lot of sympathy from the public.
Not really. I mean, it's hard to drum up sympathy for hedge funds.
Right.
Especially when they're portrayed as profiting off companies that were bailed out by taxpayers.
It's a tough sell for sure. So here we are all these years later with Fannie and Freddie stuck in this strange limbo. Profitable yet under government control, their fate uncertain. What happens next? Does anyone have a plan?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
In Shaky Ground, McLean lays out some of the options that are on the table. Some argue for completely abolishing Fannie and Freddie, letting the private market take over.
So a clean break. A return to the free market. Sounds good in theory, but could that really work?
Well, that's the debate, isn't it?
Right.
The reality is, without Fannie and Freddie, getting a mortgage could become a whole lot harder and more expensive for a lot of people. See, private lenders are understandably wary of taking on the kind of risk that comes with 30-year fixed-rate mortgages, especially without that implicit backing of the government.
So no Fannie and Freddie might mean higher interest rates, stricter lending requirements.
Yeah.
It could make home ownership a distant dream for a lot of Americans.
Exactly. It's a classic case of ideology versus practicality. There are other proposals, of course, like reforming Fannie and Freddie, giving them stricter rules and higher capital requirements. Think of it as Fannie and Freddie 2.0, leaner, meaner, and hopefully less prone to, getting into trouble.
Okay, so bit of a makeover, but they're still in the game. Any other options on the table?
There's the idea of turning them into public utilities.
Okay.
Essentially, government-run entities with a mission to provide affordable housing, but without the pressure of generating profits for shareholders.
Okay.
This would, in theory, eliminate the risk of them becoming too big or too risky.
It sounds like there's no easy answer, no clear winner in this debate. Each option comes with its own set of pros and cons.
And that's what makes this whole saga so fascinating, isn't it? It's about more than just two companies. It's a microcosm of this bigger question.
Yeah.
What role should the government play in the housing market? How do we balance the need for affordable housing with the risks of government intervention?
Right.
These are questions that have no easy answers, but they're questions that affect us all.
Yeah. It really makes you think, doesn't it? Every time you hear about interest rates, housing prices, or just the economy in general, remember Fannie and Freddie. They're lurking somewhere in the background.
Their story is a reminder that even in a free market, some things are just too big, too interconnected to be left entirely to chance.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. Knowing what you know now about Fannie and Freddie, what do you think should happen to them? Should they be dismantled, reformed, or transformed into something completely different? There's no right or wrong answer, but it's a question worth pondering as this strange saga continues to unfold.